Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation Knowledge Against Violence Speaker Series. Just as we have our final guests join us, I will go ahead and get started. So hello and good afternoon from New York. We're excited to get started with today's session, Why Have Homicide Rates Gone Up Since 2015? A Historical Perspective with Dr. Randy Roth. My name is Nieleti Hanwana. I'm a program officer at the foundation. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation examines enduring and urgent problems of violence. We do this through basic and applied research. We aim to understand the causes, manifestation, and control of violence, and we spread this knowledge to inform policy, practice, and public discourse to advance scholarship. Drawing from the Foundation's vast pool of scholars and grantees, HFG convenes the speaker series to discuss timely research and analysis of situations of violence, including war, crime, terrorism, intimate relationships, climate instability, and political extremism. Our hope is that this informative space leads to knowledge sharing, and we therefore encourage you all in the audience to pose your questions, comments, or relevant resources using either the Q&A Zoom function or in the chat. At this time, I'll invite today's speaker, Randy Roth, to turn on his camera before I go over our agenda and then offer a brief introduction. There you are. Hi, Randy. So our session today will include a presentation by Dr. Roth, followed by a brief Q&A. Again, please pose your questions in the Q&A function. I'll be posing them to Dr. Roth during the Q&A section after his presentation. And finally, before I do turn it over to him, I would like to just make a brief introduction. So Randy Roth is College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor of History and Sociology at The Ohio State University and a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He served as a member of the National Academy of Sciences Roundtable on Crime Trends from 2013 to 2016, and as a member of the editorial board of the American Historical Review from 2014 to 2017. In 2022, he received the inaugural Distinguished Scholar Award from the Historical Criminology Division of the American Society of Criminology. Professor Roth is author of American Homicide, which received the 2011 Michael J. Hindelang, I hope I pronounced that correctly, award from American Society of Criminology for its outstanding contribution to criminology over the previous 3 years, and the 2010 Alan Sharlin Memorial Prize from the Social Science History Association. The book is an internationally comparative study of homicide in the United States from colonial times to the present. Randy, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll invite you to share your screen and begin your presentation.
Well, thank you.
And you are muted. I think
we've
got your sound.
I don't think I'm muted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Letty, and thank you, Ellie, for organizing this. And thank to Dan Wilhelm, the president of the HFG, and Joel Waldman, the research director of the HFG. I've been associated with the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation for a number of years as a member of their grants review board and as the lucky recipient of 2 grants to support my work. It's a wonderful organization. I'm just so proud to be able to serve HFG and so lucky to have received a grant. Our grants program has really funded a great number of really great projects. And I feel lucky and honored to be among them. It's a great honor to be here today, but I hope that the HFG, and Dan Wilhelm has heard me say this before, that nobody at the HFG will be upset if I say that it's not quite the greatest honor that I've received in recent years. I managed finally to make it onto the History Channel for an entire minute. A very big deal. I've never watched it. I didn't have the heart to. My friend said it was a very cheesy show. It was a series on the 7 deadly sins. And I was on the anger episode, and the producers were much more interested in what Rasputin had to say than what any academic had to say. But I'm sure after my presentation that you'll all want to rush out and see it, because my mom said I did a great job. So that's a wonderful endorsement. Well, let me begin by talking about a little bit about how my colleagues and I approach this issue of violence. We're social science historians, my closest colleagues and I, and we really are concerned with, why the character and incidents of violence has changed over time in human communities and why they've varied from one community to another. And we wonder how novel weapons technologies, for instance, which we're talking about today in America, including firearms technologies, affected the character and incidents of interpersonal violence. As historians and social scientists, we can't perform controlled experiments on societies that are changing in a multiplicity of ways. We can't measure the impact of a specific change while holding everything else constant in the human experience. If I had one experiment I could perform, for instance, on the issue of firearms, I would disinvent modern firearms in the 1850s. I'd go back and leave us all with single-shot muzzle loaders, which are hard to load, take time to load, and see what would happen to our homicide rate, to interpersonal violence. But I can't do that. So our only hope as social science historians is to engage in non-experimental empirical research, which is to study societies across vast stretches of time in hope and space, in hope that deep patterns emerge in human behavior. So what we do is we search for correlations, as scientists do in geology, evolutionary biology, and other historical scientific fields. If the correlations come up again and again and again, they reveal patterns that are almost certainly causal. The patterns of correlations have been quite different over the course of the past 450 years for intimate partner homicides, for homicides of children by parents or caregivers, and for my focus today, which is homicides among unrelated adults, friends, acquaintances, strangers. Now, our goal as social science historians is to write histories that are at once humanistic, social scientific, and mathematical. That's why I've created, with the help of the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, National Science Foundation, National Endowment for Humanities, narratives of each of the homicides I've studied, as well as social scientific spreadsheets that I've analyzed statistically. Many of my colleagues and I have archived our data with the Historical Violence Database, sponsored by the Criminal Justice Research Center at Ohio State, so that future scholars can have the benefit of our work and build upon it. But they're open to the public. So if you'd like to see our work, see your research, see the narratives we've come up with, the sources we've used, you just have to type in Historical Violence Database and take a look. And I've written on the biology of the deep history of homicide as well: neurology, endocrinology, evolutionary biology, epigenetics, primatology, and the behavior more broadly of social animals, and the biological mechanisms that facilitate cooperation and competition, especially violent competition against members of their own species. So what I'd like to do now is talk about today's homicide problem. Let me share a screen now, and I'll share this screen and go to the slideshow, because I want to give you an idea of what we're looking at today in terms of violence. Now, this first graph really tracks homicide rates in the United States from 1928, when we have our first reliable national data on homicides, through 2021. The homicide rate for each age group is indexed to 1959, the year in which the homicide rate reached its lowest level in the US over the past century. The index on the left there tells you how many times the rate for each group rose from that low point in 1959, 2 times, 4 times, 6 times. As you can see, the homicide rates for every age group went up and down in unison from 1928 through the early 1960s, but they have diverged since by age. a divergence that I think has been unprecedented in our history. They diverged especially in the 1980s and 90s when victimization rates for persons ages 25 and older declined, and youth homicide spiked up and then down from 1985 to 2000. Since 2015, however, which we're talking about today, you'll see that rates are once again rising in unison across age groups. Today's rise in homicides is broad-based. Now, note that we shouldn't comfort ourselves as Americans with the thought that today's homicide rates aren't as high as they were in the late 1960s and 70s. They are as high for persons ages 10 to 14 and 20 to 24 as they were in the 60s and 70s. And they are higher for persons ages 15 to 19. That's why we as criminologists and historians of crime in the United States are concerned. And no, COVID-19 didn't lead to rises in homicides in every nation across the globe. In fact, in most nations, the COVID epidemic coincided with a decline in violence rather than a rise in violence. Now, COVID played a role, perhaps, but only in the context of broader forces that had already been driving up homicide rates in the US beginning in 2015. So I'd be happy to spend time in discussion with my thoughts about the divergence by age that's occurred since the early 60s, but my focus today will be on the causes of deep-seated, broad-based changes over time in homicide rates, like the one we're experiencing today. So I'm going to say that the keys that we've seen over the last 450 years are really the keys to successful nation building. A number of us scholars independently discovered aspects of this theory in the 1990s. Gary Lefree, Manuel Eisner, the late Roger Gould. Somehow independently, we were on the same page here on elements of this. And I put together my theory independently of all these others. But it's great to know that you have fellow travelers out there who are great scholars like Lefree and Eisner and Gould. Now, there are four correlates that I think are the keys to successful nation building, four principal elements. And I think the first is political stability, the belief that government is stable and that its legal and judicial institutions are unbiased and will redress wrongs and protect lives and property. The second is legitimate government, a feeling of trust in government and the officials who run it, and a belief in their legitimacy. Fellow feeling, patriotism, empathy, sympathy arising from racial, religious, or political solidarity, a sense that we're one people, and a sense of kinship, not just with your friends and neighbors, but even with people you don't know broadly. You have that sense of solidarity. And a legitimate social hierarchy, the belief that the social hierarchy is legitimate, that one's position in society is or can be satisfactory, that one can command the respect of others without resorting to violence. Now, these beliefs and feelings can grow weaker or stronger depending on the degree to which people trust one another and their society's institutions. When they are weak, which is especially the case during periods of political instability, homicide rates can soar into the tens or even hundreds per 100,000s per year. And these feelings and beliefs are closely interrelated. They have a synergistic effect with the homicide rate. When the homicide rate rises, for instance, because of a loss of government legitimacy or a decline in fellow feeling, the rise in homicide itself can undermine belief in government, the belief that government can protect lives and that citizens care about each other, and thereby bring about a further increase in homicide. An increase in homicide can also change the character of a society's social hierarchy and make violence a means of winning respect. Homicide rates then can soar into the hundreds per 100,000s per year. But when citizens believe that their government is stable and legitimate, when they feel a strong bond with their fellow citizens, and when they believe the society's social hierarchy is just and that violence isn't necessary for respect, homicide rates can fall to 2 per 100,000 adults per year or even lower. In most societies, these beliefs and feelings have been neither entirely absent nor widely shared. So why most historical homicide rates have fallen between the extremes. Now, again, note that each aspect of successful nation building depends wholly or to a great degree on legitimacy and trust, which are emotions. And note too that nation building isn't necessarily a benign process. Mussolini and Napoleon were in the early years of their reigns quite successful nation builders, and the homicide rates in Italy and France fell accordingly. Strong nations are not necessarily inclusive or democratic, nor are they unwilling at times to engage in state-sponsored and vigilante violence against targeted minorities within their nations. So we have to think about nation building as something that we hope in the United States will be a benign process, and it has been in many times in our history. But in many other societies, it's been anything but a benign process, but it's still, when it's successful, lowers homicide rates historically. So I'd like to begin first by talking about political stability. The first correlation between government stability and homicide rates is especially evident on contested frontiers and during revolutions, civil wars, and hostile military occupations. If no government can establish uncontested authority and impose law and order, if political elites are deeply divided, and there is no continuity of power or orderly succession, we can lose all faith in the effectiveness or impartiality of political, legal, and judicial institutions. We may take up arms on behalf of a particular political faction or ethnic or religious group and kill without restraint. Now, how can we measure political instability in the absence of complete state breakdowns? Because political instability can happen outside of the context of these massive breakdowns. The most significant measure of political instability that I found over the course of American history, and the one that correlates near perfectly with the ups and downs of homicide rates among unrelated adults, is the number of protests and riots that lead to fatalities. Not any protest or riot or demonstration, but protests or riots or demonstrations that end in lethal violence by the authorities, against the authorities, or among civilians. Now, for the colonial period, I came up with a broader-based measure of political stability. I was trying to figure out how to measure political instability. And so I was looking at banishments of people for political or religious dissent, executions for sedition, treason, heresy, and witchcraft, and deadly riots during political or community disputes. Now, what you see is it maps out the homicide rate perfectly among unrelated adults. That is, they were high in colonial America through the Glorious Revolution of 1692-3, which established a constitutional monarchy in Great Britain and ended a long series of civil wars and rebellions. You'll see the homicide rate drop in colonial America and Great Britain right through that middle period. And as soon as the Stamp Act crisis hits in 1765, boom, the homicide rate goes up with political instability, and it goes down again as we restore political stability with the Constitution and the success of the first decades of our new national government. When we look at the 19th century, and I hope you can see this, you can see that it begins really the uptick that Syria starts with the Mexican War and the divisions over that. It spikes during the Civil War and Reconstruction. It goes down again at the end of Reconstruction, and then it goes up again in the 1890s with the establishment of Jim Crow in the South and urban unrest in the North. And it's interesting, these deadly riots map out the homicide rate among unrelated adults in the United States in the 19th century. We can move on to think about the great arc of violence, of high homicide rates and violence in the United States from the mid-60s right through down to the early 1990s. And notice how they map out with deadly riots again, beginning with the deadly urban riots of 1964 and ending that string of deadly riots in 1992 with Rodney King. And I have to say that I was very worried about where our country was headed after 2015, with the protests over the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson. 2016, the uprising in the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon. And in 2017, the death in Charlottesville of a counter-protester by a white supremacist. I remember saying to friends and families, now that these deadly events were coming back, I said, this is a sign of political instability. We're entering a period of intense political instability, and I'm worried that the homicide rate is going to go way up. And indeed, with the uprisings and the response to George Floyd, with January 6th, the deep political polarization and violence around it, yes, we are in a period of political instability. And it is a very dangerous time for that reason. So deadly riots and protests are symptoms of our loss of faith in the ability of our government to protect our lives, properties, and basic rights. However, we ourselves might define them, and Americans define them very differently, particularly if they're where they are in the political spectrum. And these deadly encounters intensify in turn the political instability in our society. So it wasn't a mystery to me when I realized the homicide rate, once we got statistics, had begun going up in 2015. I had already thought that it would be going up. And in fact, once we got the data, we see that they are there. Yes, there are many forces and factions in our society today that are deliberately trying to drive us towards political instability, especially those forces and factions that are determined to undermine our democracy and have taken great strides, especially in the state level, towards doing so. So this is not only an unconscious process, something we don't plan, but political instability can be driven especially by elites who are not as deeply committed to those institutions and to majority rule as the rest of us. I want now to turn to a legitimate social hierarchy. The fourth correlate of homicide, a legitimate social hierarchy, is somewhat independent variable. Whereas other correlates rise and fall in lockstep with each other, it follows its own path in a gradual, often grinding way. It doesn't influence homicide as strongly as the three political correlates do, but it can amplify or dampen their effects. In practice, it means that when people feel that their positions in society are satisfactory, or that they will be able to earn the respect of others in legitimate ways, they're more likely to turn the other cheek if they're slighted at a social gathering, take it in stride if someone beats them at a game of cards, seek a legal remedy if they are cheated in a business deal, or maintain their composure if they're rejected by a lover or defied by a spouse. Such encounters do not become matters of life or death as long as people's reputations are secure or improving. Now, what are the most violent situations? When we look at it historically, it's when people who are previously free are forced to the bottom of a social hierarchy with no rights whatsoever. So indentured servitude is a deadly institution. The years in which racial slavery was first established were lethal. The rise of legal segregation, disfranchisement, and lynching in the Jim Crow South, as that system was established between the 1890s and the 1920s, was extremely deadly. So shoving people to the bottom of a social hierarchy when they'd previously been freed and had rights is the deadliest situation you can create. There are subtler situations, however. The decline by a third in the income of the poorest 40% of the population in Europe in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The decline in self-employment, the percentage of Americans who own their own shops and farms in the 19th century. And we all know deindustrialization from the 1960s to the present has had a dramatic effect on our homicide rates. This is a well-established fact that those cities and small towns that have lost the most industrial jobs have, on average, seen higher rates of homicide than we would imagine, whether or not the national level of homicide is rising or falling. But today's situation is really about the end of intergenerational mobility in the US since 1980 for the children of parents in the bottom half of the wealth and income distribution. you can see in this chart, which talks about this decline in economic mobility for poor Americans, that millennials who were the children of American parents who were in the bottom half of the income distribution are now today, on average, no more successful by the time they're in their 30s than their parents were. Now, what are the causes of this change? Well, there are many reasons for the rise in income inequality that we've seen since 1980. And so what we're seeing is, at a broad level, the gains that our economy has made in the United States since 1980 have gone disproportionately to the wealthy. And that income inequality has been far greater in the United States than in other affluent democracies. Only Great Britain has seen that level of a rise in the proportion. You can see here the rise in the proportion of national income going to the top 1% in the United States since 1980 has risen from about 11% to 21%. The share of national income of our poorest 50% has gone from 21% down to 13%. But in Western Europe, and this is true as well in Japan, outside of Great Britain, you'll see there's been virtually no change since 1980. Why that is, I'll leave for other people to talk about. We could talk a little bit in discussion, but it is a serious problem, and it's driving this lack of intergenerational mobility. We can see the long employment in coal country, and we know that coal country is where we're seeing the worst problems, some of the worst problems with homicide, drug deaths, suicides, etc., as natural gas is replacing coal. And of course, there's the burden of the Great Recession, which fell overwhelmingly on people who had a high school education or less. If you look at this chart, you'll see that during the Great Recession, people at a high school education or less lost 5.6 million jobs. And by 2015-16, they'd regained only 80,000 jobs. We can see that college graduate employment never went down. And since the Great Recession, that by 2016, they gained 8.4 million jobs. And of course, people with associate's degree or some college saw an initial drop of 1.8 million jobs, but eventually gained 3.1 million jobs in the recovery. So these are the broader underlying problems. What happens when we look then at, we also see a shift, last thing here, is a shift in the burden of state and local taxation. And this is not just a red state, blue state thing, it's quite widespread, that we've seen since 1980 efforts at the state level to shift the burden of state and local taxation away from the wealthy and toward the poor and the middle class. So all of these things are contributing to this rise that we've seen. Well, what happens at a county level? I've used the index of Chetty et al. I've created an index of intergenerational mobility at the county level. -1 are the counties where we've seen the most downward mobility of the millennial generation away from, in relationship to their parents. And 1 is where we've seen the highest rate of upward mobility. And what you can see is as you go from high rates of upward mobility to low rates, the homicide rate, the rate at which African Americans are killed, adults are killed, goes up by a factor of 3. If we look at Hispanic Americans, it goes up by a factor of 3. If we look at European American adults, it goes up by a factor of 3. Now, certainly absolute levels are higher for Hispanic American adults and for African American adults. That's because they're more likely to live in concentrated poverty and their children. But what you see is where the social hierarchy is losing legitimacy, where it's not working the way it has worked for generations in America, where you were almost promised that you would be better off than your parents, and your parents expected that. We've seen the rate of interpersonal violence and homicide soar. And of course, this correlates too, for those of you who are familiar with the work of Case and Deaton and that phrase, deaths of despair. Yes, indeed. For European Americans, we see a rise in drug deaths, and we see a rise in suicides. So all of these things are undermining our social fabric, but they're leading to violence against others, violence against the self, and to drug abuse. I'd like now to talk about fellow feeling. Nothing suppresses homicide within a social group more powerfully than a sense of connectedness that extends beyond the bounds of family and neighborhood and forms a strong bond among people who share race, ethnicity, religion, or nationality. If the members of a group identify with other members, even those they don't know personally, the trust, empathy, goodwill, and fellow feeling that result can deter homicide within the group. But solidarity is a double-edged sword. It can deter homicide within a group, and at the same time incite homicides between members of different social groups. When humans draw the boundary between us and them in a way that excludes a substantial proportion of the population, the potential for homicide is high. Nationalists who question the patriotism of their fellow citizens are one group that is likely to turn violent. But people are also dangerous when they feel no bond with other members of their society, when they are isolated and unable to form close ties with people, when they fear or hate their fellow citizens, and when they fear domination and have a will to dominate others. And I want to emphasize that phrase. When people fear domination and they have a will to dominate others. And ironically, they take out their anger and frustration most often against people in their own, people like themselves, friends, neighbors, and acquaintances in their own communities. So because they carry that anger and frustration with them everywhere, and their fear of domination and their will to determination to dominate rather than be dominated. Any sign of disrespect or an effort to ride roughshod over them can set them off. And that's the irony about this fellow feeling. If we take a look at the next graph, I found that the best correlate of the homicide rate in the United States from colonial times right through the 1920s is a very odd thing. It's the percentage of new counties in any decade that are named after national heroes. It's kind of an unconscious way of saying we believe in our country and we believe in one another, we believe in our leadership. So what you'll see is after the Glorious Revolution, which I spoke about before in 1692, British patriotism soared. And then, of course, you come to the Stamp Act crisis, boom, British patriotism dies, but American patriotism hasn't risen yet. We see the peak up here in American patriotism in the 1820s and 30s, and that is the decades in which our homicide rates in the United States in the North and the Mountain South were the lowest in our nation's history. The slave South is a different story, which I'd be happy to talk about. If we look at hate speech, that also tells us how we feel about our fellow Americans. And in the 19th century, the most hateful words that you could use would be the N-word to describe African Americans and their allies, abolitionist allies, and the word slave power, which is the phrase that was used to attack and demean slave owners and their allies in the North. If you take a look at the use of the N-word in Google Ngrams, you'll see again, it rises with the Mexican War, peaks during the Civil War and Reconstruction, goes down again with the end of Reconstruction, and rises again with the rise of Jim Crow South. That's a map of homicide rates among unrelated adults in the 19th century. And here's the same graph for the slave power phrase in American English. And this doesn't mean simply that people are trying to murder slave owners or that they're trying to murder African Americans. It leads to all kinds of murders, racial and interracial, that hatred people carry around with them everywhere. Now, of course, we can see today how this anger, this sense of resentment of your fellow Americans, your feeling that people are trying to dominate you unjustly, your determination not to be dominated. We can see how this is playing out among our most disadvantaged young people in our most disadvantaged urban neighborhoods. Their anger towards their fellow Americans, their refusal to be dominated, determination to dominate has led to high levels of urban violence. But what we don't talk about often enough is that the same is true for white supremacists. European Americans who hold the greatest degree of hostility and resentment towards their fellow Americans, particularly fellow Americans of color, are also prone to violence. What I did is I created an index of racial resentment, and I based it on the George Wallace vote in 1968, fundamentally. And I did this so I didn't offend my students. I told my students, whether you're Republican, Independent, or Democrat, as far as George Wallace was concerned, the former governor of Alabama, you're all just a bunch of race-mixing communists. So I said, don't be offended. He was an out-and-out segregationist. And it's interesting how that vote really represents long-term, long-standing differences at the county level in the degree of racial resentment. But I augmented this scale with contemporary opinion polls from the Cooperative Election Survey run out of Harvard. And I looked at the indexes of resentment against African Americans, resentment against immigrants, and hostility towards affirmative action. And what you'll see is as the level of index of racial resentment among European Americans goes from -2, its lowest level at the county, up to 2, you'll see that gun ownership goes way up. I am not saying that gun owners are racist. I'm a scouter. We all shoot. Our son has all the shooting merit badges. What I'm saying is racists are gun crazy. And I think we all understand that. I'm not saying this about gun owners. I'm saying it about the fact that whites who really resent people of color are heavily, heavily armed. And they're the most heavily armed group in our society. What happens because they have a gun in the home? They end up committing suicide at a very high rate, not because they're necessarily more depressed than other white Americans, but because when you use a gun and a gun is in the home, you're very likely to have a successful outcome to your suicide attempt. But what happens to the rate at which European Americans are killed? It goes up at the county level with racial resentment. So it's the same thing we see with our disadvantaged young people in our most disadvantaged urban neighborhoods. You're angry at the world, you're angry at many of your fellow Americans, you feel estranged, and you end up killing your friends, your neighbors, and acquaintances. It just turns around and comes back to haunt you. I want to note, too, that when we look at the homicide rate for European Americans, it's highest in our rural areas, whereas for African Americans, it's higher the more urban an area is. It's one of the things that we're really not talking about very much, the degree to which, or not at all really, about the degree to which white racism is deadly for everyone. Racism is deadly for everyone. And right now, the urban-rural divide that certain politicians are trying to drive home, what we can see is both our rural and urban America are in trouble during this current crisis. This isn't something that just happens to somebody else. It's not just an urban crisis, it's a national crisis. Okay, and finally, I guess I'd like to talk about legitimate government. It has to do with trust. If I feel empowered, if I feel included in the community, if I feel that people around me matter, and if I feel my government will protect me and my family, I can go about my daily life with confidence. Small slights and disagreement don't bother me as much. But if I feel powerless in the society, if I feel like I can't get a fair shake from my government, if I feel cut off from my neighbors, it affects how I live my life. Small disagreements and indignity that you can otherwise brush off as insignificant can enrage you, and in some cases lead to violence and murder. So this is a very important issue about legitimacy and government legitimacy. Now, it's a very hard thing to measure, but we used to have good measures before 2008. It turns out that the American National Election Survey, and this is the work of Gary Lafree, former president of the American Society of Criminology, a great criminologist, he came up with this chart looking at homicide rates in the United States and measures of government legitimacy and faith in government in the United States. And the American National Election Survey started asking these questions in the mid-1950s. And the first thing they said was, before you answer this question, take partisanship out of it. In other words, don't answer as a Republican, Democrat, or Independent. Answer as an American. And in fact, until 2008, people did answer as Americans. And you'll see across the political spectrum, the ups and downs in trust in government really were universal. Since 2008, people won't answer that question except in a partisan way. So we have to find different measures. But let me show you his charts. What Professor Lefree looked at is he said, here is the solid line is the percentage of Americans who, according to this survey, trusted the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. And the dotted line is the murder rate. And he said, look at that. And then he looked at another question, those who believe most public officials are crooked. When the solid line, when our belief as a nation that most of our public officials are crooked went up, the homicide rate went up, and it goes down, homicide rate goes down. So all of these things really matter. Since then, we have to look at other sorts of things. Well, no, I got to go back. Let me go. Can I go back? Yeah, previous. Excuse me. I clicked twice. My apologies. I wrote an op-ed on the History News Network because I was wondering what would happen if candidate Obama won the presidential election in 2008. What the election of the first African-American president might mean for our country. And I thought that if he were to win, the homicide rate in our nation's cities right after the election would drop strongly because of not just what this said for African Americans, but what it said for all disadvantaged people in America. And certainly by the end of 2009, despite the fact that the Great Recession fell more heavily on people of color than on other Americans, African Americans were more optimistic for their futures and their children's futures than they'd been in a generation, which is startling, but then it makes sense. There's an African American in the White House. So that's a stunning thing. So I thought it might go down in the cities, but I was worried what would happen in the white supremacist areas of our nation. And I thought that it might go up in those areas. The best tell that I thought I found was a wonderful graphic in the New York Times about voting patterns in 2004 versus 2008 in the presidential election. Because of the Great Recession, the Republicans lost votes virtually everywhere. That's the blue areas. In the darker blue, they lost the most votes. And you can see they even lost votes in Utah, for goodness sakes, and in Idaho. But in certain parts of the country, those shaded in red, that John McCain did better in 2008 than George Bush did in 2004. And that was a tell, not just for the reporters in the New York Times, but for me, that we're looking at hostility towards an African-American president. And what happened with the murder rates when we finally got the evidence? Look what happened off the long-term trend to homicide rates in the white supremacist areas. It goes up by 20%, but it's down 10% in the areas that turned out most strongly in support of electing an African-American president. So I want to stop share there too and just say that Shaitira Gaston's superb new study of the rise of homicides in 2015-16, she found that the rise was greatest in the wake of Michael Brown's death in Ferguson. It was strongest among American men in cities where an unarmed Black man had been killed by the police. In other words, it's a loss of legitimacy on the local level. And it's a pattern that Rick Rosenfeld and I had predicted on the basis of our understanding of the importance of legitimacy when we had heard that maybe things were going up in 2015, 16, but we didn't have the data. Shaitara Gaston got that data, and indeed deadly police shootings lead to a higher level of violence among African-American men in the cities where those unjustified police killings happen. And in return, the political fallout from that is to focus on African-American violence and see it as the problem rather than what's driving that violence. So in conclusion, the patterns I've spoken about today have been with us since the mid-16th and early 17th century, since the rise of the modern nation state. As nations become the focus of our social lives, our identities, our hopes and dreams, their fates, the fates of our nations, have to an overwhelming degree determined our own fates, whether we are citizens or non-citizens living within their borders. We are, after all, social animals, and the degree to which we cooperate with one another or compete against one another, sometimes violently, are driven above all by the character of our communities and the degree to which we have faith in those communities. Those feelings, emotions, and beliefs may seem impossibly remote when we think about deadly bar fights, property disputes, or when we think about robbery murders or rape murders, but they drive such behavior because they determine the degree to which hostile, defensive, and predatory emotions course through our society. Yes, it's important to look at the sparks that light the fuses in deadly encounters, but it's important to look at what fuels the explosion at the levels of our societies. Well, thank you very much for hearing me out.
Thank you so much. And I'm seeing clapping and things coming in from our attendees today. And we're now just going to open the space for some questions from our audience. Once again, you can pose those questions using the Q&A function. You can also pose those questions in the chat.